This fits right in the underrated and probably never heard of TV series category. Chapelwaite, for starters, is a TV adaptation of a 1978 Cthulhu Mythos story, Jerusalem's Lot, written by none other than the King of Horror. For the uninitiated, Cthulhu refers to a Lovecraftian cosmic monstrous entity with a scaly body, dragon-like wings, and octopus-like feelers on the face. We'll explore some of the Lovecraftian motifs in the series as we move ahead. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Beginnings and challenges. In December 2019, the streaming service Epix, now known as MGM+, had given a 10-episode straight-to-series order for adapting Stephen King's short story. The core team behind the conception, production, and execution of the project consisted of Michael Mahoney as the producer, David Deline and Adrien Brody as the executive producers, and Jason and Peter Filardi as writer-cum-executive producers. Filming began in July 2020 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, while the series aired from August 2021 to October 2021. Despite the challenge of adapting a 26-page short story into a 10-episode miniseries, Chapelwaite decently manages to stretch the horizons set by King and unravel viable possibilities. Charles Boone and the Boone family history. After spending several years as the whaler of a ship, Captain Charles Boone, played by Adrien Brody, and his family inherit a house and a sawmill, courtesy of the will of Charles's deceased cousin, Stephen Boone. The first episode's opening sequence reveals that Charles's father, Robert, played by Sebastien Lebel, once tried to kill his wife and son during Charles's childhood in 1817. On being confronted by Charles, Robert gibbered, "It's coming, the worm, I can't stop it," and followed it with, "Blood calls blood, son," before hitting Charles's head with a spade to bury him alive. However, Charles's mother shot Robert in the head and saved Charles. Cut to 33 years later in 1850. Charles's Polynesian wife, Maya, played by Lily Gao, dies on a ship, leaving him as a single father. The youngest son, Tane, played by Ian Ho, and two daughters, Loa, played by Serena Galamgas, and Honor, played by Jennifer Entz, accompany Charles to Chapelwaite, situated an hour away from the town of Preacher's Corners, Maine. On their arrival, the former housekeeper, Mrs. Cloris, hands over the papers and keys to Charles. Charles asks her if she would like to stay there as the governess, but Mrs. Cloris refuses. In the house, Charles introduces us and the kids to the portraits hung in the gallery. They are of members from Stephen's side of the family, including his father, Philip, his daughter, Marcella, and his grandmother, Silence, who also served as Charles's grandmother. The house, of course, comes from the Boones' familial wealth. We learn that Charles's great-grandfather, James, used to mine copper, and James's daughter, Silence, later expanded upon that with lumber. Speaking of the house, it seems to be infested with rats who make noises while moving through the crevices. However, the exterminator can neither find rats nor holes and droppings. Not to mention, the worms make a comeback. As Charles walks down to the cellar to stow some things, they fall on him from the ceiling. As a character, Charles retains his captain-like qualities even on land. He sails people around him through adversities, even in severe darkness. Rebecca Morgan and Preacher's Corners. The next day, the Boones explore the town of Preacher's Corners. There, we meet Rebecca, an aspiring journalist who needs to submit a finished story for the Atlantic Monthly, now known as just The Atlantic in the real world. She spots the Boones and decides to follow them for her story. We don't exactly know how she recognized them right away. Either someone must have spread the word of their arrival, or she may have recognized some facial resemblance of Charles with Stephen and Philip. Elsewhere, the town's constable, George Dennison, played by Hugh Thompson, warns Charles of the townsfolk's animosity towards the Boones, and adds that the townsfolk threw a parade when Stephen hung himself to death. Back at Chapelwaite, Mrs. Cloris brings with her a few girls to clean the place. Charles asks her if any of them are willing to work as the governess, but none are inclined. She emphatically warns him that no Boone's ever been happy in this sad house. As she and the girls leave, Rebecca shows up to nominate herself as the governess. Being the only applicant, she obviously gets the job. But she also leaves a favorable impression on everyone, except Loa. Loa's a tough one to crack. Rebecca comes home to start writing her draft for the Atlantic Monthly, only to be warned by her mother, Anne, played by Allegra Fulton, not to make trouble with the Boones. We learn that Rebecca's father served as Philip Boone's lawyer. From this point onwards, Rebecca's occasional scribblings, albeit a mixture of fictional fabrication and documentation, take on the form of an occasional guiding voiceover. On her first day at the job, Rebecca tries her best to bond with the children. The next morning, outside the church, they meet Alice Burroughs, played by Jenny Raymond, the wife of the current church minister and the daughter of the former church minister, Samuel Gallup, played by Eric Peterson. Of course, they don't allow the Boones to enter the church. To make things worse, Samuel states, "We prayed we'd seen the last Boone, because your family is a plague on the town." Next, Rebecca reveals that two of Stephen's stable hands working at Chapelwaite were the first ones to contract a mysterious illness, which later took the lives of some in the town. Overall, Rebecca is zealous enough to fight for what she thinks is right. Towards the end of this episode, Rebecca writes, "What drove this bloodline to its tragic depths? Suicide, murder, madness? To know the truth of Chapelwaite, I must know the mystery of Charles Boone." These words are visually juxtaposed with Charles taking a bath in a bathtub, kept in the cellar. The water turns into wormy mud, while a horrified Charles recalls Robert's rambling about the worms coming. However, he soon snaps back to reality to realize that it's just regular worm-free water. Loa Boone. In the first episode, we learn that Loa has consciously not talked since her mother's passing. Even when everyone voted for Rebecca as the governess, Loa remained neutral. Whether you call it cynicism, trauma response, or nuanced intuition, it undeniably makes her stand out from the others. In fact, even during the drama outside the church, it was Loa that sat still, while Charles made others leave hurriedly. You see, Loa needs braces for one of her legs. But if she were determined to leave, she would have slowly followed Charles and the others. Instead, she remained seated, until being forcibly pulled up by Charles. The reason behind her braces, you ask? Getting there. Right after Rebecca's revelation about the disease, we see Loa sitting alone outside. Charles walks up to Loa and apologizes for grabbing her like that. He squats down to Loa's level and reveals, "Your mother never would have gotten sick if she'd stayed on the island. Your leg never would have withered from rickets. But she was so strong, your mother. She insisted on coming. She demanded we were a family." He stands up while saying, "I miss her, but you can't stay silent forever." After which, Loa hugs him and decides to speak up after a long hiatus. She says, "There's something inside that you hide from us. It scares me." And that's our cue to explore this premise and move into the story. Blood calls blood, the rest of the story. FYI, the first episode's the longest in the series and has the above-mentioned title. We've covered almost everything. Here goes the rest. Charles visits the sawmill and meets the mill's bookkeeper, Abel Stewart, played by Devant Sr., followed by the foreman, Daniel Thompson, played by Michael Howe. He confronts the latter about reduction in cut board feet and firmly asks everyone to resume work as he has plans for the mill. He states that the loggers earn 2% of the profit, the foreman 3%, and Abel 3% for bookkeeping and tool keeping. Prior to this, Abel had to manage with just 1%. For being a person of color, but Charles doesn't let radical prejudice dictate the norms. Now, one of these mill workers, Edward Mallory, played by Sean Scurry, has a daughter named Susan, played by Justine Colin, who's down with the illness. It makes her look pale-skinned and sensitive to sunlight. And that's not all. The Boones also discover the graves of Stephen, Philip, and Marcella in Chapelwaite's backyard. And lastly, Edward Mallory is persuaded in the tavern by one of the men to burn down Chapelwaite. Why? To stop the further proliferation of the disease. Later that night, a mysterious man in a cassock and hat stops him. He slits Edward's throat, collects his blood in a bucket, and burns him alive, giving him a taste of his own medicine. Memento Mori. The second episode begins with a lady named Faith Pringle, played by Brioni Merritt, giving birth to an eyeless child. We learn that the church minister, Martin Burroughs, played by Gord Rand, once fathered 2 children with Alice, but they succumbed fatally to the illness. Now, Martin strays on Alice with Faith and even agrees to elope with her and the child to California. Back at Chapelwaite, Rebecca finds a letter written by her father, Christopher, to Philip Boone in 1847. It mentions that someone named Jacob believed Philip possessed an antique book called De Vermis Mysteris, Latin for Mysteries of the Worm, and Jacob was willing to pay Philip heftily for the book. Later, Rebecca and Charles take the kids to the town school. In class, a brat trips Loa up, and her necklace of seashells that she acquired from her mother breaks in pieces. Elsewhere, Charles, with the minister's help, addresses the congregation and puts forth his requirement of 50 men against payment of top wages to help him build ships for the mill's expansion. But alas, no one steps forward to take up the job. At night, a man sneaks into Loa's room and steals what remains of her necklace. And a few minutes later, Susan knocks on their door. She walks in there looking for her father, albeit confused. Rebecca drops her back at the Mallorys, but the news of her entering the Boones obviously doesn't sit well with Susan's mother, Rose Mallory, played by Joanne Boland. The next morning, Honor asks Rebecca about the illness, and Rebecca reveals that the afflicted grow confused like Susan, tire, become bedridden, and die. Interestingly, Rebecca's description of the illness is juxtaposed visually with Charles' shaving. The worms make a hallucinatory comeback, and this time they wriggle inside his nose. He pulls out 2 worms and then decides to cut through his nose with his razor to kill the worms and make a bloody mess. But there's also some truth to the worms. Prior to Charles's address to the congregation, he had gone to meet the minister, and while returning to Chapelwaite, he came across a woman in a torn white nightgown, played by Genevieve de Graves, on the road eating an apple. She told him, "The worm is calling." In fact, later, Faith Pringle also saw the same apple girl outside her room at the Morgans boarding house, run by Rebecca's mother, Anne. Moving on, Charles fixes Loa up with custom-made braces, and Rebecca helps the kids with costumes for the night of Halloween. At the Dennison's office come residence, Mary Dennison, played by Trina Cockrum, encourages Constable George to attend the festivities without her, as she's exhausted after a long day. Elsewhere, Rebecca consoles Charles by telling him, "You have good ideas for this town, even if they think you might be crazy." Charles asks for clarification on the crazy bit, and she cites the rumor that anyone who spends time in Chapelwaite is either a lunatic or runs the risk of becoming one. Chapelwaite's lore may sound like that of the Overlook Hotel. No points for guessing that Stephen King came up with his exact quote in the adapted short story. Meanwhile, poor Susan succumbs fatally to the illness, but her dying words mention that Stephen's arriving shortly with her father. Consequently, Rose accuses Stephen Boone of being alive and killing her daughter. This leads Charles to start digging Stephen's grave for answers. And, much to his horror, he finds the coffin empty. Elsewhere, someone sneaks into Mary's room and stifles her cry. The legacy of madness. Charles finds himself burying his children at Chapelwaite's backyard with a spade full of wormy soil. He wakes up from the nightmare beside Stephen's dug grave and walks into the house, all disturbed. He takes out Stephen's letter. We hear Stephen's voice for the first time, through a voiceover reading out, "Dear Cousin Charles, by the time you receive this letter, I shall be in my final resting place. Our fathers went to their graves as bitter enemies over a property dispute. I do not wish us the same fate, dear cousin." To understand the coffin situation better, Charles visits Mrs. Cloris. He thoroughly inquires about Stephen's death like an investigative officer. She answers that at first, she found Marcella dead at the foot of those cellar stairs with a pair of scissors pierced in her neck, followed by Stephen hanging around through a noose. Not funny. It's further revealed that there was no funeral, but only a viewing. Philip had put their bodies on display for 2 weeks, after which they were buried in the family plot. And after a week, a broken Philip had apparently given himself away to the sea. Charles deduces that she alone witnessed the deaths and accuses her of hiding something. But Mrs. Cloris remains tight-lipped. At the Dennisons, George walks in to see smoke all over the place. He turns out the stove fire and opens the windows, while a confused Mary tells him that she must have forgotten about it while cooking. Soon, the town doctor, Dr. Guilford, played by Dean Armstrong, approves that Mary has the illness. Elsewhere, Samuel asks Minister Martin to mention this in Susan's funeral sermon that she died from the Boone illness. Martin, in turn, asks Samuel a revelatory question, that would he carry such hate in his heart if Silence Boone hadn't bought his grandfather's land? The Boones then undergo a lot. First, the kids are expelled from school. Then Chapelwaite is attacked with stones at night, and even Charles is beaten up until Rebecca and Honor intervene with guns. Later, one of the rabble-rousers gets his throat slashed and the blood collected in a bucket by none other than the mystery man in a hat and cassock. The next morning, Loa wakes up wearing a repaired necklace. In another room, Rebecca brings some medicaments to soothe Charles's wounds. Among those, Charles finds a bottle of toxic mercury prescribed by a Dr. Benjamin Frost to Stephen from an asylum called the Frigate Island Hospital. Abel brings word that none of the mill workers has shown up. Charles joins the dots and storms into the tavern to fire his mill workers. Thompson keeps taunting him until he's thrashed by Charles. Charles also warns everyone that if anyone ever attacks him or his family again, he won't hesitate to kill. Having done that, Charles meets Frost at the island in search of answers, but all he receives is a resounding affirmation of lunacy, much like his predecessors. Back at Chapelwaite, the apple girl pays Taine a visit. She throws her wormy apple at him and leaves him with the message, "Tell your father to find the book." Later, Taine informs Charles about this and horrifies him further. Charles walks up to the study only to be disturbed by the sound of movement behind the walls. He breaks through the walls with a hammer, screaming, "There are no rats!" The children and Rebecca walk in there to see what he's up to, and in a manic fit, Charles almost strikes Loa with the hammer. The episode ends with Charles setting up an ice bath down in the cellar. And, to his horror, he finds "Blood Calls Blood" inscribed in red on the cellar's ceiling. The Promised. The episode starts with a blast from the past. It's the Chapelwaite Manor back in 1781. We see Silence Boone, played by Morgan Melnick, sipping her tea, only to be interrupted by something in her mouth. She first pulls out a bloody tooth, followed by a worm. Her hallucination is broken off when a young Philip asks her if he and young Robert could go play outside. Back in the present, Faith is once again paid a visit by the Apple Girl, who reminds her that she gave her blood and promised always is always. She adds that there's no point running or hiding, as the reach of the worm is infinite. Later, Faith meets the minister and stresses that they should elope as soon as possible. Elsewhere, Taine discovers a secret tunnel at the barn, leading to passageways inside the walls of Chapelwaite's rooms. The prior impression of a rat infestation coupled with this evidently refers to the 1923 Lovecraftian short story, The Rats in the Walls. Later, Charles goes inside the tunnel and waits for Stephen to arrive after sundown. But the hallucination comes back to haunt Charles, this time in the form of worms wriggling inside his arms, chest, and neck. It stops after he hears someone get in. Meanwhile, Rebecca reaches the denizens to call for help. She follows the noises into Mary's room, only to be pushed aside by the mysterious man in a hat and cassock. The man makes a run for it, and Rebecca chases him. He eventually escapes, but is kind enough to show his face. Behold, it's Philip with fangs. Back in the manor, Loa meets Stephen with fangs. He asks her how did she like her repaired necklace. Charles intervenes, and Stephen asks him to find the book before being shot by Charles. He falls down from the window, only to get back on his feet after a little gagging. Soon a mob gathers outside Chapelwaite, calling themselves the Promised. They tell Charles that he's been invited to Jerusalem's lot the next day by Jacob, the one with the answers to his growing madness. The Prophet. This episode also starts with a glimpse into the past. The year's 1780, and Silence's father James, played by Christian Murray, has killed people at the church. Silence confronts him with armed town officials on her side, only to hear him rambling, "It's coming, Silence. I can't stop it." Silence retorts, "The book is corrupt. Look at what it's done to you." James answers he killed his loved ones, as he couldn't let them suffer. He comes ahead holding a book in one hand and a knife in the other, to stab Silence, but is shot dead by the town officials. Back in the present, Loa tells Charles about Stephen's lucrative offer of fixing her leg and making her meet Maya. As Charles explains that he's preying on her weakness, Loa retorts that missing mother isn't a weakness. Amidst such tensions, Loa later finds Rebecca's writings about the Boones. Next, Abel and Charles ride to James Boone's former mining town, Jerusalem's Lot, and Rebecca takes the children to the Morgans' boarding house. On the way, Abel tells Charles that rumors suggest James Boone was a killer, a ghost, and even the devil himself. Meanwhile, Martin comes across Alice in the church. We learn that their kids loved Marcella Boone's company at home. The conversation quickly moves to Faith's newborn child, and ends with Martin's confession about him straying on Alice. Elsewhere, Constable George recalls witnessing Silence Boone hanging herself and the kids with nooses outside the Chapelwaite Manor. George managed to save Robert and Philip, but Silence pushed him away and let herself die. Meanwhile, Loa shows her siblings Rebecca's writings, and in another room, Rebecca confesses her feelings for Charles to her mother. Minister Martin shows up there to meet Faith. Their conversation reveals that Faith once served as a prostitute in New Bedford, where she'd met Jacob. Jacob believed in a god called the Worm and wanted to raise it. She followed Jacob in his quest to Jerusalem's Lot and came across a cult of like-minded, undead vampires. Faith's horrendous description is juxtaposed alongside the horrors witnessed by Charles at Jerusalem's Lot as he meets Jacob. Thinking her to be delusional, Martin interrupts her and tells her that they'll leave tomorrow. Elsewhere, Jacob reveals that James Boone founded Jerusalem's Lot and unearthed their cult's equivalent of the Bible, De Vermis Mysteris. James wrote his name with blood in its pages, damning himself and every Boone since. That explains blood calls blood. Apparently, Philip and Stephen were turned into vampires by being fed Jacob's blood in exchange for the book, but they couldn't retrieve it. He also reveals that Stephen lured Charles through his will to locate the book, as only a living Boone can be subject to the wormy hallucinations, which are essentially the book's call. Jacob offers to free Charles and his progeny from the curse in exchange for the book. At the Denisons, George finds Mary feeding on Philip's blood. Philip attacks George, but George pierces his neck with a hand cross. However, Philip flees. Elsewhere, Honor and Taine confront Rebecca about her writings, but Loa is nowhere to be found. Suspecting she could have gone to Chapelwaite, Rebecca rushes there with Taine and Honor, but Stephen takes her away with him before they reach there. The next morning, Charles, while returning, finds Loa lying dead on the ground. The Offer. This episode opens with a past that's almost caught up with the present. It's 1848, and Marcella Boone, played by Acadia Colin, is hiding behind a door inside the manor. Both Stephen and Philip, who by now have already turned into vampires, are looking for her, and she hid the book somewhere. But while running from the two, she falls down the cellar's stairs and dies. It seems that Stephen was indeed heartbroken by Marcella's death, but a cold Philip asks him to save his tears for seeking Jacob's forgiveness. It's possible that post Marcella's death, Stephen hung himself to death to escape this curse. But things didn't exactly go as planned, so Stephen went back to living the vampire life. Back in the present, Charles finds bite marks on dead Loa's neck. Back at the Denisons, Dr. Guilford, Constable George, and Minister Martin discuss Mary's situation while she rests. Guilford remarks that he found similar marks on the bodies of William Albright and Francis Blair, probably the stable hands who first contracted the disease. Martin brings up the fact that Faith also has bites on her body from people at Jerusalem's Lot. George and Guilford visit Mrs. Cloris's place to look for answers. The latter recounts that Philip and Stephen spent time at Jerusalem's Lot and were only seen at Chapelwaite during the night. One afternoon, however, Mrs. Cloris found them lying dead in Philip's room, but Marcella clarified that they were just asleep. Thinking that the girl was distraught, she brought her home with her. Later, Philip arrived at her door, alive, and asked her never to speak of this, or he would bleed the life out of Marcella and her. She also clarifies that if Philip feeds off Mary's blood, he'll do so until she dies. But if Mary feeds off Philip's blood, she's no longer George's wife. At the Denisons, Mary wakes up from her rest and tells Martin that God speaks to her and offers her his blood to live forever in the dark. Elsewhere, Charles wraps Loa's body and buries it in the sea, whereas a guilt-ridden Rebecca seeks an apology from the kids for hiding her writings and confronts Charles about them. At church, Martin meets Faith and hands her a single ticket to California. He insists on staying at Preacher's Corners, believing his congregation will need him the most during such dark times, and promises to join her once this is over. Later, Martin arrives at the boarding house, looking for a room. Meanwhile, Faith is on her way to the Cumberland situation in a carriage, but she's intercepted by some members of the Promised, including the Apple Girl, and stabbed to death, while the baby is taken away by the Apple Girl. Elsewhere, George smothers Mary with a pillow to prevent her from turning into a vampire. But just like Stephen, she comes back to life, and so does Loa, even after being lured underwater. Loa takes Charles to the barn to meet Stephen and Philip. She can now walk without braces. Stephen and Philip tell Charles that if he brings them the book, the Boones will finally have peace and prosper in the coming dark. The episode ends with him hallucinating that he's surrounded by worms all over the barn. De Vermis Mysteris. The episode begins on a hallucinatory and dreamlike note. But long story short, Charles finds the book hidden in the coffin of Alice and Martin's dead children. The moment Charles opens the book, he has a vision of a world with a red sun and a ring around it. In there, Jacob's the only man walking over hordes of dead people. Loa calls out to Charles from the other side of a gate, while Stephen and Philip stand behind trees. She thinks the book will usher in a new beginning and she can reunite with Charles, Maya, and her siblings. Charles clarifies that it's instead the end of everything. Then Stephen comes forward and urges Charles to give him the book, to be rid of the book's cursed calls. But Charles turns away and returns to the manor. He and others start boarding the walls with planks and paint white crosses on them. However, Rebecca, Honor, and Tane all figure that Charles is clearly not himself, and a frenzied paranoia sets in. At Jerusalem's Lot, Jacob hears the whip poor wills and figures that they'll have to go to Chapelwaite to procure the book. Meanwhile, Abel goes and calls the constable for help at Chapelwaite. And just outside his place, an unmanned horse carriage is seen carrying Faith's dead body. Obviously, the minister is heartbroken at that sight. Back at Chapelwaite, Charles, just like Silence, sets up nooses for him and the children. However, Rebecca hits him on the head with a spade and knocks him unconscious, saving their lives. Charles wakes up to his senses to learn that the book is with Mary Dennison, restrained in the cellar's bathtub, while George, Martin, and Abel are there to help fight whoever comes for the book. George asks Charles where did he find the book, and the latter hurts Martin with his answer. Martin recalls that freshly laid flowers, grass, and weeds all rotted near their grave. Makes sense. Elsewhere, Mrs. Cloris finds the undead Boones feeding on her livestock in her barn. She tries to shoot Philip, but is instead devoured as fresh human meat. In the manor, Rebecca and Charles reconcile their differences, whereas Martin blesses each room but questions his faith in God. Down in the cellar, George lets Mary feed a little blood off his hand. Elsewhere, Jacob and his cultists embark on their journey to Chapelwaite. At night, the undead Boones gather outside Chapelwaite for the book. Charles, George, and Martin collectively reel in Philip into their room like a fish, and Charles stabs Philip and decapitates him. Soon, Jacob's cultists gather around the house with torches. Hold the night. With the cultists waiting at a distance outside, Captain Charles delivers a moral-boosting speech, stating, "Tonight will reveal much about ourselves. There will be times when you lose heart and you want to quit. Do not." Down in the cellar, George checks in on Mary. She reminds him that she's still his wife, and the only difference is that she's been dead and returned. George retorts that they both were supposed to spend eternity together in heaven. Mary clarifies that there is no heaven. She feeds a little on his hand and tells him that only she can save him if only he feeds on her blood. Upstairs, Rebecca raises the concern about two gods, theirs and the cultists, to Charles. Charles answers that the winner of the waged war decides which god to follow. Rebecca retorts that she always thought of God as love, and both of them embrace with an implied kiss. Elsewhere, Rebecca reminds a broken Martin that he needs to fight, if not for himself, then at least for the children in the manor, who deserve to live for more than the next few hours. Charles confronts George to prevent him from turning into a vampire under the sway of Mary's insistence. George tells him about how he once saved the lives of Philip and Robert back when he was 17. He adds that if he didn't, Charles wouldn't have been born, the curse wouldn't be there, and Mary would still be humanly alive. The Chapelwaite siege begins. We learn that some of Jacob's acolytes are still mortal humans. The Apple Girl breaks the news to Martin that Faith's baby was Jacob's and not his, breaking Martin all the more. Martin theorizes that if their god is a falsehood, so must be the worm. He suggests handing the book over to them, as they cannot raise a non-existing god. However, his hypothesis takes a back seat when he gets a good look at Mary down in the cellar. Meanwhile, Jacob's acolytes find the tunnel in the barn and get into the house through the passageways. Everyone except Tane barricades themselves in the dining room. Tane gets separated and hides behind a door. One of Jacob's men almost attacked Tane, but Loa chews him off and saves him. She then asks him to trust her and come with her. The others fight some of the cultists, including Christopher, played by Jeremy Ackerman. After warding some of them off, some others, including Jacob, reach the stairs. The tension is palpable as everyone retracts to the cellar. Rebecca and the kids say their prayers while Martin and George guard the door. Charles holds a gun behind Honor in case they have to kill themselves, but the cultists withdraw and leave the house. As everyone's surprised, Tane reveals that he handed over the book on Loa's suggestion to save themselves. The Gathering Dark. After reaching Jerusalem's lot, Jacob asks his cult to bow down their heads in praise of Loa. The Apple Girl initially hesitates, but upon Jacob's insistence that Loa did what no one could, she does it. Jacob introduces Loa to his church hall, where Charles met him a few episodes back, and calls it her new home. Loa asks him, why's the book important to him? Jacob answers that it's the key to a world devoid of light and with endless feed. Loa asks that will her family also turn into livestock? To which Jacob answers that the cult is her family now. Back at Chapelwaite, Charles and others prepare to gather men from Preacher's Corners and ride to Jerusalem's lot to give the cult a final fight. They realize that the only way to persuade the townsfolk is to show them what's happened to Mary. Back at the lot, Loa is sent to feed from the Apple Girl in a barn. After feeding, the Apple Girl reveals that once she becomes strong and immortal, she'll exact revenge on all those who wronged her. Charles and others arrive at Preacher's Corners with a tied-up Mary. They try to explain the notion of coming back from the dead, but none of them buy it. George unties Mary, and the sun burns her to a horrifying death. Meanwhile, Alice invites Martin home before he leaves for Jerusalem's lot. Charles meets the townsfolk at the tavern to tell them of what they are up against. So far, fire, sunlight, and decapitating are the only proven methods of killing the undead. Dr. Guilford suggests striking the hearts to deplete all their blood. Back at the Burrows, Martin tells Alice that Marcella Boone didn't spread the illness. Instead, it was Philip and Stephen who walked the house at night and preyed on their children. The same was probably the case with Susan, the stable hands, and anyone else who contracted the illness. Moving on, Alice's invitation to Martin was just an excuse to poison his food and kill him. Later, Charles walks in there to see that Alice has fatally poisoned herself as well. He tries to console a sobbing Samuel, who then shoots himself in the mouth. A total gore fest. All women and children gather inside the church. Elsewhere, Jacob and his cult prepare to raise the worm. He states that the book's not to be closed until all the pages are read, and begins chanting incantations. Meanwhile, Rebecca and the men of Preacher's Corners start riding to Jerusalem's lot. All that can be ascertained about Jacob's incantation are Giagan Vardar Yog-Sothoth. These exact words are mentioned in the adapted story. Here, Giagan refers to the worm god that Jacob and his cult serve, whereas Yog-Sothoth could be another name for Yog-Sothoth, the key and the guardian of the gates to the dark world. Both gods have their roots in Lovecraftian lore and are what he called the Great Old Ones. The Keeper. Jacob temporarily stops his incantation and asks Loa to read the rest. Meanwhile, Charles and the others reach Jerusalem's lot when the sun, albeit eclipsed, looks like a crescent moon. As Charles prepares to light torches, the sky loses its light and the sun literally looks like the NCS circle. The stars in the sky seem to move and burst, one after the other. The fight begins, and Charles manages to impale two of them through the heart. Christopher drags Rebecca with him and offers her his blood, but she refuses. Rebecca confronts him, thinking that he's under some sort of sway, but Christopher clarifies that he chooses this consciously. A severely wounded George offers Charles his hand cross and sacrifices himself to the predators to clear the way for Charles. Charles enters Jacob's church and offers Jacob peaceful coexistence in exchange for the book. Jacob refuses and sends forth Loa to kill him. Charles helplessly keeps moving backwards, asking Loa not to listen to Jacob. The Apple Girl attempts to stab Charles from behind, but Loa stabs her first and saves him. Charles takes on Jacob, but is clearly overpowered by him. But Stephen runs in and steals the book, distracting Jacob. Charles utilizes the opportunity and impales his throat with George's hand cross. A destabilized Jacob falls backward with his head on a nail. Finally, Charles separates Jacob's head from his body with a machete. He then finds Stephen and attacks him. Charles picks up a nearby rock and hits Stephen's head repeatedly until he's destabilized, then finishes him off by putting a log through him. And Rebecca closes the book to stop the apocalypse. The sky slowly clears up, and Charles and Rebecca reunite with Loa. The only other survivors are Abel and Dr. Guilford. They burn Jerusalem's lot to the ground and return to Preacher's Corners. Back in the manor, tensions erupt between the siblings after Loa's return. Charles devises a strategy to protect his family from the curse, and after discussing it with Rebecca and all his children, he feeds a little on Loa's blood and asks her to feed on him as well until he dies. Dr. Guilford then surgically places the book in his chest and issues a death certificate. Meanwhile, Abel digs a grave, just deep enough to pretend that they've buried him. A few minutes later, Charles returns from the dead with fangs. Truth be told, when all dressed up, Charles seems to be the spitting image of Count Dracula. Eventually, he says his goodbyes and leaves on a boat for the unknown. Interestingly, Loa and Charles do not seem to get burnt from whatever little light is out there. Probably the vampires are resistant to light after sundown. The episode ends with words from Rebecca from a possible near future. She writes, "On that strip of weathered Maine sand, I watched as the sea reclaimed the only man I've ever loved. Charles Boone's absence is as raw today as it was that ill-fated night, but I find comfort in the presence of his children, Honor, Loa, Tane." Marvelous conclusion. Honestly, the final war waged at Jerusalem's lot deserved more screen time. The build-up to this climactic war took 9 episodes, but it was over in less than 20 minutes of screen time. All in all, it seemed like they tried to cram 2 or more episodes into the final episode. We also think that the backstories of the Apple Girl, Faith, and similar women should be explored further. Yes, we know that a second season is not coming, but who knows? Maybe a film could explore these. Apart from these, the entire timeline of the story has 2 factual inaccuracies in particular. 1. Marcella Boone died in 1848, but her grave in the opening credits shows her year of death as 1849. 2. Considering that George Dennison was 17 when he saved the lives of Philip and Robert back in 1771, he should be about 96 years old during the events of 1850, but he hardly looks older than 66 here. To conclude things, is Chapelwaite worth your time? Absolutely. The opening credits sequence with intricate visuals and a befitting score kinda makes up for the super rushed finale. Treat this as an exploratory spin-off of the short story instead of an adaptation, and you'll be good to go. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.